Okay, I want to thank you guys for coming to this live stream. And we do these every Wednesday at 2 p.m., and that's -6 GMT. So pretty much we're doing it from Midwest America. So then you kind of have to figure out what the time zone is for you if you're watching it from Europe or a completely different section of the world. So this live stream in particular is going to be more stripping it down to the basics, because I hear a lot of people just asking for blending and how to make it look seamless and things like that. And as much as I believe I should do a full tutorial or even a mini course on just doing the basics, I thought I would do a live stream and maybe just share some initial thoughts and feedback that I have and maybe help you guys out a little bit. And like I always do, I have the comments right next to me here. And if you have any questions about doing things that are basic, from blending, what brushes to use, if there's anything on your mind that deals with this particular subject matter, feel free to ask it, and I will definitely make sure to answer you guys. And with that, I think I'm going to get started. So let me take off all of these things on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to just lay out a few tips on just getting started, just in general. The first thing is, usually I like to work on a mid-tone gray, and this is because white can be a little harsh, and then when you're drawing on it, it's more intimidating. So that's why even with if you ever done a the life studying course where you're drawing nude models, it's usually done on some kind of tone paper, whether it's really lightly brown or a gray, and that's because it's easier to draw, at least for the mind. And then usually the hues are more pure. So if you're working on white, sometimes you might be choosing colors that stand out more because you're trying to put contrast onto the white. But on gray, they kind of show the actual purity of the color. So that's the first thing that I'm going to go through, is just working on a different color background. Now, when you're using your brush tool, so here I pretty much have the basic brush tool with shade dynamics and transfer turned on. You kind of can create mostly everything you need to. And that's something that I want you guys to really understand, is that a lot of concept artists, they use just one or two brushes for most of their pieces. And usually these brushes are very basic. And I see probably most use some kind of a textured brush. So usually it's like a chalk brush or something where they'll kind of use it throughout the entire piece, and then use specific brushes for either detailing or for starting out. So environments, I see Feng Zhu uses a lot of tree brushes, whereas another artist that worked on Wreck-It Ralph uses only the chalk brush for the entire piece. So it just depends on what you're comfortable with, and don't feel like it's intimidating to have all these brushes. You can do what you want with just the basic brushes. And these basic brushes on this top lineup here, you can download on Concept Cookie. So I think there's 9 of them. Yeah, so the 9 brushes that I have here, they pretty much could create the entirety of pieces that you want. So all these extras are just extra detailing, textured brushes or whatever specific that you may need it for. All right, so I like to work with just a transfer turned on, and that's pretty much where the shape will stay uniform the entire way through, but the harder I press down on my tablet, the less opacity is being shown through. And that's because this is how I blend. And it's definitely different for every person, but usually I like to work in small circles and then build up my values. So you can see as I continually press down harder on my tablet, it gets a shade darker. And then if you can kind of recognize how hard you're pushing on the tablet and how much color that's putting forth, that's really important to know. So I can, without even putting down my brush, if I want to put, let's say, a 40% opacity down, just through muscle memory alone, I know this is how hard I have to push. And then let's say I want more of an 80%. I have to push about this hard. And you can kind of see when it's at 100%, I feel like that's about correct. So definitely getting to know how hard to put how much pressure to put down on your tablet is very important. Yeah, I hope you guys like the simple brush package, because I know the circle hardage brush and the chalk brush are pretty much the two that I use for almost the entirety of my pieces. how do we get transfer in GIMP? So in GIMP, it has a selection that you can choose. I forget what it is off the top of my head. I don't believe it's called transfer, but it's pretty much under the brush menu settings, and you just click it and then make sure that you have your tablet set up with GIMP. Because if you don't have your tablet recognized in GIMP, it won't work correctly. And that's something I could even post if you need to after the live stream on how to set up your brushes with GIMP. Okay, so now on to blending. Let's say we have a sphere here. Let's say that we have a light that's coming from the overhead, standard lighting. What I would do, and I should be kind of yelling out these keyboard shortcuts too, is if you hold Alt, it brings up your eyedropper tool, and pretty much whatever color is selected from the eyedropper is the one that your brush then will currently be using after you let go of Alt. So I'm going to pick up that background color gray, and then as I pick up, you can see how on my color picker now, it's chosen that light gray. So then another really big tip is resizing the brush. So usually if you're just starting off, I know I was taught to use the brackets, which are on your keyboard, and it'll change your brush size, but it kind of is a nuisance, I would say, because it's just time consuming. And if you're like me and you like to keep your left hand more on the bottom left of the keyboard, you have to go ahead and reach for the brackets. And that's not really something that's, I guess, practical. So a shortcut that you can do, and on a Mac, it's if you hold Control and Option, and I believe on a PC it's Control and Alt, but if you hold those two and then slide your brush left and right, it changes the diameter of your brush. And the cool thing about this is then if you go up and down, it changes the hardness of your brush. So then really quickly, I could go from, let's say, I need something like that, and then I need it at 100% hardness, but I want the diameter to be smaller. You can do it within a few seconds. And if you were to try to do that on the brackets and then using your brush menu settings, it would take a little bit longer. Okay. So now onto how I blend. So when I blend, like I said, I don't have the shape dynamics turned on. I just have transfer turned on. And pretty much I'll just lightly push on wherever I want the color to be laid down. And something else that's really important. You can kind of see how this is getting like a stagnant look right here. Where like the brushes look like they're going like this. And that's because we have a spacing set on the brush. And to find how to edit that, you have to go to your brush tip shape. And pretty much on the very bottom, there's a setting called spacing. And depending on how high you put that slider bar, you can almost make polka dots if you want. But I think the standard is set at either 10 or 15%. And that'll give you those rings. And if that's not something you're looking to have, you can completely turn them off. But I like to keep mine around like 5 because sometimes it's good to get a little more edging to the brush rather than have it be a complete solid stroke. So I'm going to pick up that color again using Alt, and that's bring up my eyedropper tool again. I'm going to make my brush size bigger holding Control and Option, moving it right, and then I'm going to lightly push down on the tablet. And pretty much I like to make just a base as to where the light's coming from, and then just softly kind of billow it out. So if you are a lefty, it probably is easier then to keep your right hand more on the left side of the keyboard and work like that. So then probably most of your keyboard shortcuts then should be set more on the right side. Because for me, like I even have my brush and eraser tool, which is normally B and E, set as my X and Z. So literally I can keep my left hand in the bottom left corner without having to move it at all. Alright, so back to blending. So usually I'll work in color layers. So since I'm working on such a dark gray, I'll pick up a lighter gray to build up on top of that, and then I'll keep pretty much staging my grays up. So actually I'll put them on the side here. So let's say this is our gray that we have. I'll make it even lighter. And then I'll work it into whatever we have here. And usually as I refine and get smaller, you want your brush size to get smaller as well. Because it's kind of impractical to be working at a brush size that's this big like we did for the first color, because you can see how it just covers the entire circle, and that's not really what we're going for. So rather, I'm going to make my brush size smaller and then blend out where the lighting's hitting it first. So usually I'll make it strongest right there and kind of blend it then out. So then the good thing about not having shape dynamics turned on is I don't have to constantly put a ton of pressure on the tablet to get that full range of the brush size. But like I said, that's all personal preference, and that's just something I like to do. But definitely if you're doing stuff like line art or something where you want more of a line weight to it, then definitely have your shape dynamics turned on. Okay, so then one more time, I'm going to make it even lighter. You can see that since I have my hardness set at 100%, I'm going to constantly get this kind of layering effect that we're seeing here. And that's because the actual edge of the brush, there's no softness to it at all. It's just a hard edge. Hence the name, a hard edge circle brush. So as I make it even smaller, so we're almost at a pure white, so this is like a specular level at this point. I'm going to make it really small. Just kind of dab it on there. So then from here you might be thinking, okay, well that looks alright, but then we're still getting some of that weird edge work that we don't want in our shading. So then that's where I'll usually go back, and maybe even I'll turn my hardness down to maybe about halfway. And then now when I blend it, it'll be a lot easier to see those edges kind of blend in with the rest of the piece. Now, this is something that definitely comes down to personal preference, because maybe you don't like having any edges seen at all. Then you probably want to work with the soft edge brush more than the hard edge brush, and then just continually like blend those colors together. But when I look at a piece, I really like when it has a mix of the two. So when it has a nice blended look to it, but it also, you can tell it was painted. So I like seeing some edge work to it. So that's why I try to do a mix of using the hard edge brush and the circle edge brush, or the soft edge brush. And pretty much when I get to this point, I'm trying to refine like any hard edges that stand out way too much. It's like this dark color is kind of a harsh transition. And something important to note is when you're doing like shadows and stuff, you don't want to add value to a shadow. Because if two objects are casting a shadow and the shadows are intersecting each other, it really doesn't create a double shadow unless if there's multiple light sources, but rather it would just kind of blend into one toned shadow. And another really important thing to understand is that your eraser tool just can be so beneficial when working with this kind of stuff. So although your brush tool will lay out the colors for you, your brush tool, if it has a transfer turned on as well, can pretty much work in that same way. So you can see as I refine the edges, make it look more sphere-like, rather than doing it with a brush tool, I can just do it with my eraser tool and erase right up to that edge. So definitely think of the brush and the eraser as like a combo process. So usually I'll start off with my brush tool, and then as I get more into like the refining stages, I'll then open up my brush tool and then kind of erase excess area where I didn't want the brush tool to get to. So it also helps out in not worrying about being perfect right from the get-go, because I know a lot of concept artists, especially with myself, you want things to look right from the start. But it's important to understand that it's a process and you have to be patient with your art, and you can't just rush perfection, you know? And you have to understand that it's okay to slop out the colors and like be really sketchy in the beginning because you're just getting your ideas out in your forms and your shapes. And it's really important to get those out first and then refine on top of it. Because if you're working really rigid and stiff right from the get-go, then it's going to read really rigid and stiff once you do the refining stages. So the more loose you can be in the beginning, the better. And then try to refine it then as you go along. But don't get too loose where then your refinement stages just takes forever because you have so much to work with. So you just want to be kind of time conscious as well on what you're working on. But I'm assuming that just starting off, it's less about worrying about how much time you're taking on something and more worrying about, am I understanding the process? Am I feeling like I'm understanding what I'm doing? So then if this was a sphere, I would probably have a nice little bounce light on the other side. So then I would just use my brush tool. And the reason I'm not using my eraser tool is because then if I wanted to move the sphere, and let's say I wanted to move it somewhere where there's a background rather that's different than just this gray background, you would see it through the sphere. And that's not at all what I'm trying to do with that. Sometimes just blending it all together. So you can see how it's a lot of your eyedropper tool. And I'll actually write this on the side. So pretty much it's working in 3 stages. Sorry, my handwriting's so weird on this tablet. But pretty much it is, you want to eyedropper, brush size, and blend. So usually when I go to blend, I'll pull up my eyedropper first, change the size if needed, and then blend it together. And pretty much I do that process for the entirety of my blending. And once you become familiar with the keyboard shortcuts, it almost is like you're working just as much with your left hand as you are your right hand. So even though your right hand's actually laying down the color and everything, your left hand is pretty much like the mastermind behind it because he's the one changing the size, he's the one picking up the color, and if needed, he's the one doing Control Z or Option Z or Command Z on a Mac to do your undo. Okay, so then that was the basics on how to just, basically shade. So then from here, why don't I make this smaller? I can go into doing like a hard edge stuff, but if there's any questions that you have, just leave them in the comment section, and even if it's something relating to this, I'll try then to get to it and then show you guys how I would go about doing whatever questions you have. All right, so for now, I'm going to go into doing a hard edge and how I would do that. So let's say, what kind of a transition should I do? Let's say we want to do just like a simple rock or something. Is it wrong of me to use masks with brushes instead of the eraser tool to refine the edges? I do this to be able to paint any mistakes I do. Is it wrong to use masks? No, because I know that for like a solid year, I was using the mask layer for almost everything. And it's really efficient and effective, but the only problem is when it comes to time and you're trying to manage it, it is time consuming. So even though you can get really great effects in like, I don't know, because I can't say you shouldn't do it because there's a lot of people that do it and use it in their work and they have absolutely awesome results. I just find that sometimes it can be very time demanding. And if you want to learn to be faster, then I would only use masking for like a few different layers, not for the entire piece, I guess. But like I said, that's more down to personal preference. It's something that I do usually near the end of a piece. And usually it's for like, let's say I have a character and I have like, let's say, maybe they have like hair blowing in the wind or something, but it's all solid. I don't know if you can actually tell what this is. It's a character, but If I wanted to mask out the character and if they had like a really detailed environment behind them on a different layer, then obviously I'm not going to be using my eraser and brush tool for refining the edges unless if I absolutely had to, where I could just mask out the character layer and work from that and not worry about if I'm going outside of the edges. So your masking tool can be really effective. And yeah, it's also called, you can also do a clipping mask, which is a little different, but pretty much serves the same purpose. Yep. All right, so back to this hard edge that I'm doing here. So usually when I know that I'm going to be doing a hard edge, I'll usually work, or I'll try to understand that it has to work more sloppy first, then I'll use my eraser tool to refine it. So let's say we're having the light source come from the same direction. So like I said, I know in the back of my head, even before I start this, that this edge right here is going to come to a complete point. But I'm going to make sure that I lay out my values first and then worry about refining the outer edge. Because I know a lot of artists, and something that I did for the longest time when I was starting off is I would always want a perfect edge to work with before working inside of it. And I know for the longest time I would only do line art first, and then I would work on building the colors inside. Where now I kind of work in the complete opposite direction, where I almost just lay down my colors right from the get-go and then work on refining the edges almost near the end. And it's a different technique, and it's not one that I'm like, yeah, you have to do it my way because it's so fast and you get things out right away. But it's something that I've learned to do that's comfortable for me, and honestly, it's more fun for me. So maybe if you absolutely hate laying down colors right away and you love putting down line art, then that's definitely something that I don't think that you should stray from, you know? You want your art to be fun to work on. You don't want it to feel like busy work. And even though I say that, like, obviously there's going to be times where we're refining and detailing, it does take time, and you don't want to get lazy with it either. But you still want it to be fun. Okay, I'm just going to put a few more shadows on this. Because I don't want that definitive edge just yet. All right, so now we're imagining that this surface is like this shape, this like pentagon-ish shape. It would probably be catching light pretty uniform throughout the entire shape itself. So usually it'll get darker just from the top to light, or top to bottom, just because the light source would most likely be from overhead, and it would be catching the top lighter than it would be near the bottom. And anytime you can throw a gradient in your piece, it usually will help break up the monotony of the color. And as I say that, though, don't think that you should be throwing in gradients everywhere, because then it just becomes distracting, and you need at least some form of a unity between your piece. If you don't know what a clipping mat or like layer masks are, pretty much if like the sphere up here, so let's say we wanted to only draw inside of the sphere. Oh, you know what? Or yeah, I'll talk about that now. So if I wanted to mask that out on this new layer that I just created, if you hold Command on a Mac or Control on a PC, I believe, it'll select everything in the layer that you selected. So you can see how the marching ant selections are now around everything that's in that layer. So now if I go to this bottom area where on the layers, and if you click on the circle that's inside of the rectangle, that's masking it out. So now you can see in our layers, it has this like sub layer effect here. And we want to make sure we click inside of the actual layer itself, not the mask layer. And then from this point, then you can only draw in the sphere. Oh, it seems you get it now. Ah, okay, you answered it for him. Okay. So, all right. So that's layer masking, and you can see how it can be really effective if you want to stay inside of like a certain area or shape without worrying about going outside the line. Can you edit the mask? You most certainly can. So let's say, actually this will be a good example. All right, so let's say that the red kind of billows out outside of the sphere. And then you decide that you don't want it to be a sphere anymore. You want it to kind of break away from the sphere itself. Well then, if you go to the layer mask itself, and rather than grab your brush tool, grab your brush tool and then select white. Now let's say we draw it on. You can see how it reveals all that excess red that we were just putting on our sphere. And Command Z will undo that. So for mask layers, white will add to the mask layer, while black will take away. So if I made the entire mask layer black, absolutely nothing would be shown. And if I made everything white, then everything that you put on your layer mask will show. So you can see how even the loops that I did on the sphere show now. So it's definitely something cool that you could do where, let's say you wanted to just edit the mask but not what you already have laid out. Yeah, so I do have a bit of lag on the chat, and that's because there's just so much running right now. So if I don't answer your question right away, that's probably why. But just know I'm looking at it constantly. Yeah, it's definitely very, very handy. All right, so now back to our hard surface that we have over here. So you can see how these edges right here are not refined at all. And they're bumpy and it's kind of soft edge, and that's not what we're going for one bit. So then I'll grab my eraser tool and literally I'll just erase the excess and try to work in like angulars. And since the background layer is so close to that color on the top of the rock, that's something that you should be kind of aware of when you're doing your pieces, because you definitely want there to be some contrast between the values you're laying out. Because you won't be able to see your concept if it's blending into the background. So usually then I'll kind of lay out a different background color if it seems to be blending too much. All right, so now you can see how we have more of those refined edges now that we erase some of it. And from here is when then I'll grab my lighter colors and then just edge it out even further. Because I'm imagining that even though it's a hard edge, it still has that slight roundness as to where the two faces meet each other. So if I can draw my arrow right on it, right there. So this line going down. And then usually, since it's a rock, it has like usually different faces that you can add the different colors to then after. Yeah, I'm not sure why the chat does have like a minute delay, but just know if I'm like a minute behind you guys, it's because that's why. It's not because I'm not checking it constantly. It's because it's just lagging a bit. All right, so now if this rock was planted in the ground, you don't want just like a solid plane underneath of it. So let's say then this was our like grass or whatever ground plane that it was. You want there to be some kind of a transition between the two. And I'm not saying that you then take the colors from the rock and then start blending it into the grass, because that's not exactly realistic in the least. So pretty much you want to imagine if this rock's been sitting here for a while, think of like the overgrowth from the grass that has gone onto the rock, or maybe there's vines that now grow on the rock because of its placement and wherever the woods are. So usually when I do environment stuff, I'm always trying to think of the weather conditions, think about how this rock has been there probably for a long time. It's probably pretty grounded into the dirt itself, and there's some dirt that's built up around it. So hard edges make sense in a lot of areas, like on the rock surface itself, but then in areas where the rocks meet the grass or the ground plane, it usually is better to have some kind of a transition, and not a blended transition, but more of an environmental transition. Something more like that. And you can see how I just kind of fade outwards. And I'm not going to be worrying about leaving brush strokes behind, because for this kind of a concept, I'm not going for hyper-realism. I'm just trying to show that this rock is implanted into the ground. And that's another thing that's pretty important to note, is that not everything you do has to be hyper-realistic. And I know, or even photorealistic, because when you're a concept artist, you're trying to get a concept across. So sometimes concept artists, if they're drawing like quick interpretations of skin or characters, the skin on the character itself will maybe just be a uniform color, and they're not worrying about making the entirety of the skin look realistic or the transitions, but rather they're just trying to get the concept across. But that's more, like, I would say, advanced understanding of concept art, where I'm trying to keep this live stream to more like the basic understanding of digital painting and blending, and just some tips and tricks I've learned when I first started and wish I was told, because I know I spent a lot of time wasting on trying to make things look perfect all the time way too soon. Okay. So that would be more of like doing hard edge and how to do transition stuff. So I think the last thing I'm going to do for this stream, because I wanted to keep it very basic, is going to be working with blending colors. Because even though we've worked with blending different grayscale values so far, I think it's also important to know how to blend colors together. So let me go ahead and erase some of this that we got here. All right, so something that I've been working for like the past week is just creating a new color palette, because I feel like the one I have, as good as it has been for me for the past few, like I would say a year ago maybe I made it. I think I'm ready to update my colors and work with colors that I use more often. So I noticed that there's a lot of colors that I never use that are on my swatches. So far here are some of the color transitions that I have, and I'm going to be working with. So just kind of an intro to color is try to work with more neutrals first and then work with your saturation. Because if you work with something that's just completely saturated everywhere, it's really hard to make it work because your eyes don't know where to focus on. But if you have a lot of neutral colors, like on the palette that I have here, let me put it where my swatches are now. So working with more neutral colors, let's say I lay out some of these. You'll see how then when I lay out a more vibrant color, it demands your attention. And that's the way that colors work. And okay, so now let's say I grab the most vibrant red that I possibly can. So if I lay it down, you can see how immediately the red is just, it demands your focus. Like it's an eye grabber. So pretty much when working with colors, try to work more with neutrals first And don't think, okay, if this character is wearing a green shirt, it has to be green. And you can also think about, I guess that can be a little confusing to say, but okay, if a character is wearing a green shirt, rather than working with a color that's like, okay, I want it to be green, so I'm going to choose a color that is an obvious hue of green. Rather than doing that, try to work with more neutral looking green. So usually when I'm choosing my colors, I work with very, very desaturated base colors. So I'll probably work with something more along this line rather than something like this. And then even as I build up my colors, I'm thinking about, okay, well, what light is hitting the surface of this green shirt? And if it's outdoors, it's probably going to be more warm, so we're going to throw in more yellow hues. So right away, I'm going to make it more saturated and higher in value, and then I'll literally pull my hue slider bar down toward the yellow. And then pretty much I'll build up my transition. So then I would do it one more time, pull it even closer to yellow. And actually I'm going to do it one more time for like highlights. So then for my green scale, it'll look something more like this rather than something like this, which is something I definitely do not recommend doing. And when you're working with color, you want to be thinking about working with not only your value transitions, but your hue transitions as well. Because now if I block out these two color, you can see how this bottom one, you have a lot more to work with than the top one. Because the bottom one even has some warmth added to it with the yellows, and where the top is, it's more cool, but there's no deviation from the color hue transitions. So the bottom one I could work with a lot easier than I could with the top one. So I guess the biggest thing I can tell you when working with like laying out color transitions is don't grab a color. So let's say I'll do it with a different color. Let's say we did it with red. Your base color should not be this super saturated color and then just go lighter in value. So this is an example of something I would not recommend doing. But like I said, you can always make something work if you know what you're doing and if you do it well. But usually these are just like basic mistakes that I see, and that's why I don't want you guys doing them. So now this is the way that I would recommend not doing it on this top here. So now let's say, okay, well then Tim, how would you do a red slider transition? So usually for my baseline color for the red, I would go really, really dark, like almost black. And that would be my base color. And then I'm going to build it up. So I'm going to go closer to the pure red in saturation and a little lighter in value, and then maybe I'll bend it just barely a tad toward yellow. And I'll do that again. And then one more time. And if you think that maybe, okay, so this is looking even a bit too orange for me, then what you could do is literally just grab those colors, pull up your hue and saturation bar, which on a keyboard shortcut it's Command U, but on a PC it's Control U. Just go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. So then if I just toggle this, or slide the top slider bar, the hue one, if I slide it left, you can see how we get more of the red hue rather than so orangish. And the reason I like doing or pulling up the hue and saturation bar a lot is because then you can work with editing your saturation, the lightness, the different hues of it. And there we go. And this is just something that I do with all my colors. I try to work a lot with not making it these kind of bland looking transitions. And that's probably the biggest problem I see starting off when picking colors. Okay, but now even though we have kind of a general sense of how to pick your colors, now how would we use them in our pieces? So, okay, so you might have really awesome color transitions all laid out for you, but now how do we use them in practice pretty much? So let's say, I'm thinking of what would be a good example to draw. Well, okay, since it's Halloween week, let's say I wanted to draw a droplet of blood. Let me erase what I have right there. There we go. Alright, so when working with blood, rather than grabbing this top slider bar, which would be that it's really dramatic red, I'm going to start off really dark and then build up the red inside of it. So I'm using the blending techniques that I did for that sphere on the top here. Just blending it out. And usually I'll make my brush smaller as we go through. Then you can see, actually I should zoom in so I'm not working, or maybe I'll just make this bigger. Because on a live stream you can probably barely even see this droplet of blood. Oops, not that big though. So yeah, you can see how the red then, it just becomes a lot more, there's a lot more character to it. Or what's a better way to describe it? There's more, I want to say boldness, but the boldness usually will come when you lay out the lighter or the more saturated reds. So you can see how as I'm building up the reds on this particular area, your eye is being directed and pointing to the center of this color. And that's something that you can think about when you're using colors in your pieces, is how you are directing people's eye in your piece. So usually color vibrancy, along with obviously there's a lot of things that direct people's eyes, but color vibrancy is one of those that definitely will demand an eye's attention. So then as I go for the very most saturated color, it's the one that I'm laying out almost the least. So what's funny is the largest color that I laid out, which is the very dark red, even though that's what color I laid out the most, the color that demands your attention the absolute most is that very light orange, or that very saturated orange that is just barely placed on the highlight point of the blood sphere. So it's definitely something to keep in mind while you're using your colors as well. And if you have any other questions that you want to ask me, I would feel more than happy to answer them before I cut the stream off. Let me see here. Okay. So working with skin hues. Okay, so this is definitely something that will take a few times to get used to, because skin is difficult. I'm not even going to try to make it sound like it's not a difficult concept to grasp, because it really is. So let me go ahead, I'll erase this section over here. Because you probably hear artists say all the time that you should be adding your purples and blues and yellows to your skin, but it might just sound really confusing. And you might be thinking, well, how do I do that? You know, it might not make sense to you. So on this left side here, I'm going to work kind of fast, but then this would be my way of creating skin quickly. And the skin hues that I'm grabbing from this color palette over here, they will be included in a post coming out soon on color swatches and downloading the swatches. So if you want to use the skin colors that I'm using right now, you'll be able to, because it's going to be a free post. So usually when working with skin, try to work with a variety of subtle color changes. So when people say, you should add red to the skin, that doesn't mean you should add, this red, because that would just make it just way too intense and distracting. But usually that means, okay, so if this is my color picker, just change the hue slider bar down so this new skin color is a bit more pink. And now let's say we want to add some more yellows to it, slide the hue bar up, and you can see how this one has more yellow. It's more yellow tinted. So it's not thinking, okay, we want to add red or we want to add yellow, but rather, I don't know if you guys can see this that well on the Twitch, but I'm pointing at this box over here. So you want to be working with the colors that are in the center rather than the colors that are on the outside. And if you missed the start of the stream, you don't have to worry because thankfully Twitch records all these streams and then they are placed in a video gallery if you want to watch it afterwards. And this is definitely a stream that I've been wanting to do for a while because a lot of people just ask me, I just want to understand the basics. Like, I can't do characters if I don't even understand how to blend colors together. And I more than understand, and that's why I almost want to create like a whole kind of like fundamentals course on just doing stuff like this. Because I know stuff like this can be almost even more useful than learning how to do a complete character. Because if you don't understand fundamentals correctly, then you won't understand the more advanced concepts. Alright, so you can see how I'm doing that same technique of eyedropper, brush size, blend. And that's pretty much the technique I do for shading everything. And then usually for skin, I'll throw in some highlights. And there we go. So I'm going to make that larger so you guys can see it better. But you can see how in different areas of the skin, you can see some like very small subtle gradients where like this area is more yellow compared to this area which is more pink. And usually when I work with skin, wherever the skin is closer to the highlight, I'll usually make it a little more yellowish. It'll be that more of a yellow tone. But then where the shadow or the drop off of the light happens, that's where I'll make it more pinkish or more red, if you want to call it that. And the best way to do skin is have that nice transition from light to shadow. And then you can show off your spectrum of colors in that transition. All right, so I'm going to cut it off here, but I want to thank you guys for coming to this live stream. And I know that my canvas is kind of looking like a mess, but I hope you're able to follow the different concepts that we were talking about. And I guess I'll do a quick recap. So when working with just shading and blending, try to think of a technique that works for you. So for me, I like to do my eyedropper, brush size, blend. Eyedropper, brush size, blend. And I just keep practicing, or I keep reusing those steps over and over until whatever I'm working on is blended correctly. And if you're working with a hard edge brush, you're going to be getting more edges, but if you're working with a soft edge brush, the transition will be a lot more smooth. But you don't want something being so soft that it's hard to catch edge work or like where something ends. So you want to be conscious of that as well. Then for hard edges, don't be afraid to use your eraser tool. And just remember that if your object is sitting on something or if it's on a ground plane of some sort, you want there to be some transition between the subject matter and the back or the plane itself. And that could even just be like a shadow. So if they're standing outdoors on cement, just the character's shadow on the pavement would be a transition from one to the next. When working with color, try your best not to work from green and then just work lighter in values. Think about pulling in your temperature, so if it's cool or if it's warm, and think about your hue shifting, and that could be from green to yellow, or actually just hue shifting in general. Usually if there's a light source and if it's a warm light source, just slightly bend your colors to yellow. And then if you're working more with shadows, just bend it more to purples or blues. And you'll see how then your color selection just becomes that much more vibrant and has more depth behind it. And then lastly, when working with skin, usually I like to have a preset swatches in mind, but usually when starting off, I'll work with, if you can see this, like a neutral sort of brown. And then from there, I'll work up more yellows to where the light source is from, and then more pinks onto where the shadows are. And then usually I'll throw in a few highlights depending on the skin and the light source itself. All right, so I want to thank you guys so much for coming to this live stream. I feel like this has been one that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I really hope you guys were able to pick up some tips and tricks to try on your own. And we do these live streams every Wednesday at 2 p.m., and that's -6 GMT. And I hope you guys have been following with the Halloween stuff that we've been posting lately, and maybe you're working on a Halloween piece for the contest. And just stay tuned for what's